Okay. Let's start with states. Features of states. Clearly defined territory. You've got a map of Australia. We know exactly where Australia is, probably to the nearest metre. Really clearly defined borders. And it's the same for states that have neighbouring shared borders. We don't have any shared borders, but Spain and France know exactly where their border starts and ends. So very clear borders. The state can use force. So police can arrest you. The military can be called out to perform certain duties. The state is authorised to use force against its citizens. And in most cases, states recognise other states using force against their citizens. And we don't complain about it. We don't complain about Indonesia abusing its citizens because the state is authorised to do that. The third one, there's a central government. We know we have a government. It's led by Tony Abbott and the Liberal Party, the Liberal Coalition. A government which controls that territory and the people in that territory. We might not like the idea of control, but it's a key feature of states. The second big thing is sovereignty. There is a population here, and sovereignty is about authority over that area. So states have clear sovereignty. There are leaders who are recognised as the leaders with power and authority over the people in the territory. And don't worry, we're going to do sovereignty in depth as its own thing. But states have territory, they have sovereignty. Importantly, they're recognised by the international community. And this one's a little bit fuzzy because you'll say, well, who is the international community? In most cases, it's the United Nations General Assembly. So a state becomes recognised when the international community recognises them. And usually that's a majority of the General Assembly. So once you get into the General Assembly, you can be a state. Do we know who the most recent state is that's joined the world political community? Any guesses? It's from Africa?
South Sudan.
South Sudan. Yeah, that's the newest state to be recognised internationally. And then there was another one, I think was Macedonia, because they split from Montenegro, and before that was East Timor. So they're the three most recent states to join the international community. So recognition. I might set up the state of Bakalja down the road. It's not going to get recognised by anyone. I might have sovereignty over my little bit of territory because I've bought the land. I won't get international recognition. I also don't have power and authority over my territory because it's in Australia, so I have to give in to Australian laws. Importantly, it's not culturally homogenous. So what this means is the people within a state are different. They're not the same. And you can see that in a room right now. If we went through all the countries that we're from our parents, our grandparents, from where we've been born, we're not all the same. We're not all of British heritage anymore. In 1901, maybe that was the case. Maybe we were culturally the same. But we speak different languages, we're from different countries, we practice different religions. So a state is diverse. You can either go with a state is diverse or a state is not homogenous. Homogenous means the same. That's where the homo comes from homosexual and homo sapien, and the homo always means same, it's Latin. Features of a state. Australia is an example, clear territory, central government, recognised by other states. Two examples of states, you can see that they're diverse. The census in 2011, people had to say which culture, which ancestry they connect to, and it's very diverse, all over the world. It's predominantly British-Irish, but it's changed. Indonesia is similarly a state, incredibly diverse. Many, many different groups who identify as being different and still don't call themselves Indonesians, they'll call themselves Javanese first. So these are two examples of states. So it begs the question then, what is a nation state? It's got all the features of a state, except that it is homogenous. The people in the nation state are mostly the same. Same language, mostly the same religion. Can we think of any examples? Japan? Yeah, really good example. I've got a map coming up in a second with some other examples. The key is the bit that's underlined. Don't copy down the rest. Most of the citizens are united by factors which define a nation. Language, common descent. So that's not the case for Australia anymore. It once was, it's not anymore. We're no longer united by one cultural background. Some statistics suggest by 1950, majority of Australians will be of Asian descent. Because of the migration changes we've experienced in the last 50 years, we'll continue to experience. So we're culturally diverse. Australia, not a nation state. Here are 3 examples of nation states. Egypt. 99% of Egyptians are culturally Egyptian. The majority of Japanese people are ethnically the same. They practice similar religions, similar language, and it's an ethnic group that hasn't changed significantly. The Mongols are very similar. The map tries to capture areas of the world, so the more yellow or orange, the more culturally the same. I think 90% of China is ethnic Hans. They're the majority group. They usually repress the other groups in quite terrible ways. The darker the colour, the more diverse. So that's the key difference between a state and a nation. They're the same in all ways, except one is diverse, one is mostly the same culturally. And this takes us to the third thing we need to know, because we need to know states, nations, nation-states. A nation. It doesn't have recognised sovereignty. So it doesn't have power and authority over its people. So Indigenous groups don't have power and authority over Indigenous people in Australia. Indigenous people in Australia have to abide by Victorian laws, Australian laws. So no one recognises the power and authority of the people who might be leading these nations. You can be a member of a nation and have certain cultural things in common, and often nations have, well, they have to have a common identity. And you're about to see some examples of that in a second. So the idea of nation is like a bond or common identity, common culture. So distinguishing features, there might be language, religion, ethnicity, and people feel a sense of attachment to that common identity. Some examples. This is, I was going to say Kurdistan. It's not a state. It's not a nation state. This isn't an internationally recognised country. And I'm going to try and avoid using that word from now on because we don't want to use the word country. But the area that's highlighted in orange is an area where lots of Kurds live. The Kurds are a people. They're ethnically the same, but they don't have their own nation state. The main reason is that if we wanted to create Kurdistan, what has to happen? Yeah. Look, Iraq's got to lose northern Iraq, Iran's got to lose western Iraq, Syria's got to give up some territory, and Turkey's got to give up a lot of territory. These other states aren't going to give up territory. No one gives up territory anymore. The world's been divided up. There is no more land to discover. It's all been discovered, and everyone's claimed the piece of the pie, and it's fixed. Other than in war, territory isn't going to shift. So we're not going to get a new nation state here. There's no way these other nation states are going to give up sovereignty. They're not going to give up control. So the Kurds are going to be a nation, a group of people together sharing identity, but they're never going to be a nation state. And we can argue forever about whether that's good or bad. You know, the argument doesn't matter for us, except to see what a nation would look like. Oh, the Kurds, they're in one geographic area, no recognised territory, no recognised authority. Another example, West Papua. And we're going to talk about West Papua more and more throughout the year because they're a really good case study for so many things we do. So you've got Indonesia across this whole area. This section here is West Papua. Most West Papuans are similar to that. I mean, I've picked a picture which goes to the extreme, but they're still very tribal. There's still people who live in the jungle and have relatively primitive ways. And they've always identified as West Papuans. But they're not going to get their own state or nation state because Indonesia isn't interested in giving up land. For one reason, this land is some of the richest mines in the world. So for Indonesia to say, sure, you guys can have your own nation state, you can have your own representative at the UN, they would have to give up tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars worth of resources. And no one is going to do that. So the West Papuans are a nation, but they're not like Australia. They don't have power and authority, they don't have territory. My favourite. These are the Indigenous Nations of Australia. So every assembly, when Lucy and Tess stand up and one of them says, we recognise the land of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people, they're two different nations of Indigenous people. And the reason we recognise two and not one is because St Catherine's is on the border of the two different nations. At other schools, they just say one of the two because the school is clearly in one nation. But where the crossroads here, that's the Wurundjeri, that's the Bunurong. So I went to school a little bit further down in Mentone. We said the Bunurong, we recognise the Bunurong people. But St Catherine's is more along the borders there. So these are two Indigenous nations. And you can,
when did institutions start having to recognise?
They don't have to, they choose to. And I think it probably started about 15 or 20 years ago. But it didn't happen before that.
Some TV shows do it as well.
Really?
Yeah, I was watching one and it said like you recognise.
Okay. It's becoming more common. Yeah. So obviously, many different nations, different cultural practices, really diverse cultural practices, and different languages, almost every one of them. No country on earth has a higher rate of language loss than Australia, because most of these nations are losing their languages. So we've got the highest rate of language loss in the world, but they don't have territory, they don't have sovereignty. They're certainly not represented internationally in any kind of international body. So these are nations, many, many nations. Okay, so I've got a few questions for you. One of the things that becomes important this year is the type of question that you're being asked. I really should have done this